Welcome to the Quill's journey. Settle in. Let the story begin. If you're enjoying the atmosphere, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear what stood out to you. The night Matteo woke to gravel whispering under his window, the world still pretended to be normal. That pretense lasted as long as it took for the crickets to stop. Silence arrived in a clean slice, like a scalpel, and what remained felt pressurized, air with weight, dark with posture. He lay in the cabin's small bedroom counting his breaths and the infinitesimal clicks of settling wood. I thought it was a raccoon, he would later say. But the quiet was wrong. Animals don't cancel the world like that. Lake iron smell bled through the screen. The glass held a faint reflection of the room: cot, wool blanket, a backpack half-zipped, a paperback face down like a fallen bird. Beyond that reflection, something resisted light. Not the ordinary black of midnight, but a contour that refused to absorb the porch bulb's weak halo. He steadied the trembling in his knuckles by naming objects: side table, headlamp, boots, like a diver touching anchor points on the way down. He didn't open the curtain. Not at first. Survival often begins as a failure of curiosity. He waited until the footsteps withdrew, until the gravel settled into memory, and then forced himself to look. The yard presented only the tilt of the rickety canoe rack and the clean stripe of the logging road. The pine bough that scraped the eaves in wind hung still. At dawn he carried a mug of coffee down to the inlet and found the tracks. 3 digits, no heel, each tip leaving a crescent of sheared mud. The print spaced with metronomic economy, neither wandering nor rushing. They angled in and out of the shallows as though attending to something beneath the surface, a resonance he couldn't feel, a chord in the water. He measured them with the folding ruler he'd found in the tool drawer: 9 centimeters across, almost 13 long, depth variable despite uniform silt. Something light with leverage. I kept telling myself it was a hoax. Then I remembered there's no one for 30 kilometers to hoax me. Fear catalogued for him. The peeled birch with metallic-smelling sap. Reed beds bent without breaking, as if parted by an attentive hand. A granite step with a shallow semicircle scored into it, as if a blade had tested itself for sharpness. On the way back he noticed a second anomaly: the cabin door had been left on the latch, a thumb's width open. He could swear he remembered closing it. On the kitchen table, his topo map, yesterday folded to show the lake, now lay open to the ridge, contour lines like ribs. Beside it, the pencil he'd used sat snapped in two, graphite end smoothed, as if touched to a tongue. I told myself I was tired. I told myself a draft moved the door. I told myself the map had been like that all along. He looked at his hand and found dried sap glittering in the whorls of his skin. He hadn't touched the birch. The truck died on the logging road at noon. The radio didn't burst into static so much as it pressed into his teeth, fillings buzzing, pressure building behind his eardrums. The windshield wavered as if peering through hot air, and then everything cleared and the engine coughed back to life just long enough to lurch him into a pothole that tore the transmission mount. He walked back with the jack handle over his shoulder like a pilgrim's staff: no service, no passing vehicles, the kind of sky that turns colorless when it's thinking. He spent the afternoon making the cabin smaller. Towels stuffed under doors. Chimney flue closed. Tripwire across the back steps, braided line tied to a tin cup of pebbles. He mapped the floorboards' complaints with chalk, marking quiet paths from bedroom to kitchen to storm door. He studied the ridge on the map because someone had asked him to. A saddle in the contour line suggested vantage. If he were hunting, he'd climb to that rim. Night is an amplifier, he said. Shadows make habits louder. The tapping began just after 11. Not a knuckle. Not a claw. A fingertip testing grain. A slow, polite, learning tap that moved from window casing to baseboard to the exact place his ribs touched the floorboards. He turned his headlamp off to save batteries and discovered the dark contained strata, within it a colder rectangle hung where the window glass was. He set his palm to the pane and felt nothing, and then, an inch inside, a sudden chill like a skin on cooling milk. When the tripwire sang at 2:11, the cup bounding once, pebbles scattering in tinkling hops, he restrained every instinct to spring. He stayed prone with the chef's knife tucked along his forearm, listening as the back latch lifted and settled again. After a count of 60 he fired a flare through the front door. The red-white wash turned the pines into bone. He caught a glimpse then, a thing that slid instead of stepped, low as an otter but jointed like a mantis, moving not through the open but through the angle between shadows, reordering light to accept it. It didn't flee the flare. It withdrew from it the way a tide withdraws from a shore it had been considering. By morning the fridge hummed as if nothing had paused it, and an ordinary frost laced the window edges. Normalcy is bait. He ate peanut butter from the jar. He rewrapped the line. He lifted the rug and found a fine, glittering residue along the plank seam like graphite dust. He rubbed it between finger and thumb. His mouth filled with saliva at the metallic sweetness of it, as though his body recognized a taste from a childhood he never had. "I should have left then," Matteo said, and his voice, when it reached this part, always dropped. "But leaving is a plan, and planning meant admitting the world wasn't the world I thought. And I didn't want to give them that. Not yet." The map stayed open to the ridge. The pencil sat in two parts, ends smoothed. Outside, the lake looked like a polished coin. The forest waited, patient as a machine that has measured its part. He treated the cabin like a patient with a slow internal bleed. Where was the pressure going? Where could it escape? What could be clamped? He inventoried: 5 days of food if careful, a good water filter, a lantern with a cracked globe and half a can of kerosene, 2 flare cartridges left, a roll of duct tape, paracord, a space blanket, a serviceable knife. He lacked a working truck, a radio that carried voices instead of weight, neighbors. "I told myself rules," he said. "Make noise on purpose so surprise belongs to me. Move slow enough that I can think but not so slow I'm being mapped. Leave signs for myself I won't misread when panic comes." He slid into the crawlspace beneath the floor, headlamp halo cupped with one hand, breath fogging cold air that smelled like rain on iron. The joists vibrated with something that wasn't wind, a faint counting inward like the tick of a watch set to a foreign second. He put his ear to a joist. The rhythm paused for his contact, then resumed offset by a breath, shadowing him. He sealed gaps with tape and towels. He tied a pan by a shoelace to the back doorknob so the smallest pressure would translate into noise. He marked escape arrows on the baseboards with chalk: bedroom window, storm door, the narrow cut between spruces where a man could slip sideways and a larger thing might not. He checked the eaves for nests, the rafters for old squirrel routes. He placed the lantern where its spill could reach the floor without skylining him in the window. "People think survival is knives and fires," he said. "Mostly it's rehearsals. Teaching your hands what they'll have to do when your brain quits." The tapping came and went, a metronome that grew bold, then coy, then bold again. At midnight a frost band drifted across the floor like a ring in pooled gasoline. He smelled coins and cut grass. The back latch lifted with trembling delicacy, set down again. The house learned the noise of its own parts through another's fingers. He slept in slices, 15 unspooled minutes at a time. In one slice, something moved across the roof in a slow loping slide, as if circling an ice hole. In another, the chair beside the door creaked as if someone made the civilized decision to sit. Near to a thin filament appeared ankle-high across the kitchen, visible only where the lantern's breath of heat made it wobble. It was the kind of thing an unhurried person would not see until his shin found it. He swung low with the knife. The blade rang without contact and then bit something that wasn't there. A sweetness flooded his mouth and the hair on his arms lifted as if a party balloon had skimmed him. "It recoiled," he said. "Not a snap. A withdrawal, slow enough to be smug. Like it had an extra second of gravity I didn't share." When he tipped the lantern to track the filament, fire licked along the line without consuming it, as if flame were a kind of dye. The lick slid under the door and hissed in the cold air beyond. The studs resumed their counting, faster now, like an excited heart. The pan on the doorknob swung and tapped wood with exquisite patience. At 4 he tasted sleep paralysis without the paralysis, the sense of someone standing close enough to press fog against his cheek, the awareness of his own breath echoing off a second mouth's shape. He breathed with purpose, inhale 4, hold 4, exhale 6, stealing calm from sequence. He wondered if there were 2 outside, or 3. I kept thinking of the map flipped to the ridge, he said later. It wasn't random. They were telling me where we'd finish if I let them. It felt polite. The way a herding dog is kind to sheep. Morning arrived as a grey dilution. The house resumed its ordinary ticks. He brewed coffee and found that his hands had learned to move quietly as a side effect of fear. He opened the door slow. The cup of pebbles lay where the line had thrown it. The porch rail bore a handprint smudged in resin and glittering dust, 3 long crescents and a 4th offset mark placed too far for a human thumb. On the step, another shallow semicircle gouged into soft pine, as if the visitor had idled their testing edge and angle while he pretended to sleep. I started talking out loud then, he admitted. Not to it. To myself. To the space. I said the names of what I could still do. I said, I can leave if I choose, I can stay if I choose, I can hide, I can fight, I can be patient, I can be stupid for only a minute at a time. It helped. He packed a day kit with deliberate thrift, water, jerky, the space blanket, the remaining flare, the knife. He left the lantern. He took the map. He followed the inlet up toward the ridge by stepping on stone to fracture his trail. The forest climbed in stacked ranks of spruce and jack pine, the lake shrank behind him to a coin in a green palm. On the saddle the wind made a throat of the pass and sang low. There, in a gully, the world had a bruise. Not a color he possessed a name for, but an absence of ordinary green arranged into planes. It looked like oil until it flexed and light grabbed edges. About the size of an upside-down canoe, half buried in duff, pulsing as if breathing without air. Beside it stood 2 figures. Seeing them was a failure of depth perception, too narrow where a body should carry muscle, jointed in too many places, reflecting the forest like a slightly wrong mirror. When one cocked its head, the membrane flexed, drinking light. I didn't move. A fly walked my lip and I let it. My chest hurt from not breathing. It turned its face, or whatever serves as that, toward the ridge. Toward me. It knew. But it didn't rush. He withdrew by angles, space blanket strips bound around his boots to smear his edges. The counting in the studs was here too, only in the trees, a rhythm slightly faster than his pulse. By the time he reached the narrow cut between spruces, his own prints were overprinted by 3 crescent marks that seemed to have been there first. The cabin door stood open when he returned. The map was gone. The pencil, rejoined with extraordinary neatness, lay across the empty place where the map had been like a hinge, a suggestion. They weren't going to smash me, he said. They were going to move me. He slid the dresser against the latch anyway and waited for the day to thin to gray. He expected panic to feel like speed. Instead, it thickened time, laid syrup over the moment-to-moment and left the larger hour clear. He portioned his courage, 50 minutes to prepare, 10 to rest, 10 to listen, repeat. He boiled water and poured it into a steel thermos for burning. He rehearsed the window exit, hands on frame, feet planted, twist and drop. He whispered keys to himself, knife low, never slash at what you can push, heat and motion are separate tools, until the murmur took shape and untied his chest. I was thinking like a human who believes in straight lines, he said. They weren't. They were all about angles. Between things. So I tried to think in wedges. He left at last light, keeping the cabin between himself and the lake as long as he could. The inlet ran north, the ridge rose beyond, contour lines tightening into a saddle of stone. He climbed by diagonals, pausing where the wind funneled to listen for a change in pressure. The pines stood with wet black backs, needles hissed under his boots. After 40 minutes the lake was a pewter rectangle, the cabin a thumbnail idea he didn't like touching. On the saddle, the semicircle gouges multiplied, practiced arcs in granite like a machinist's test cuts. He passed a frog's husk that hadn't been gnawed so much as persuaded into dust, the bones unmade in a heatless process his vocabulary wouldn't hold. The hair on his forearms prickled despite sweat. His eardrums popped twice, as if he'd ducked under a wave. The gully presented itself as a prudent place to watch from and also a trap. He lay where spruce shadows feathered his outline, space blanket crinkled tight over his pack to break his geometry, chin on his wrist. The membrane flexed below with a pulse that reminded him of an ultrasound he'd seen once, a heart beating in a black sea. The two figures attended to it with stillness so complete it made his muscles ache. He counted seconds between their smallest motions out of habit, trying to find rhythm. There wasn't one. It knew where I was the whole time, he said. Not because it heard me. Because I was the different thing. The closest one lifted an arm, and at the gesture a part of the membrane bulged, thinning until he could see the outline of pine needles through it. It wasn't a craft in the way people meant that word, not built so much as grown to a specified effect. He imagined it unrolled across water. He imagined being under it, looking up at a sky that had been replaced. A small rock, nudged by his breath or his fear, skittered against his boot and tinked down the slope. The figure turned. No eyes to meet, no face to insist meaning upon, only the sense of attention cutting across cold air like a wire. He did not breathe at all for a full 20 seconds. He thought of his sister laughing at his old jokes. He thought of the handprint on the porch rail. He thought of how much of his life had been luck disguised in hard work. He withdrew in ZS, trading distance for uncertainty. Behind him, the counting in the trees picked up, not louder but nearer. Twice he paused and watched a place where there should have been a shadow become a passage, a thin sheet of wrong that slid between trunks as if the forest had been hinged to allow it. When the cabin finally appeared through trees, the door was cracked by a thumb, exactly like the first night. Inside, the map was gone, he already knew that. In its place lay his pencil in two joined halves, repaired past any visible seam and set at an angle pointing at the door, as if to remind him the world had axes and he was on the wrong one. He held the pencil and felt an unearned grief for something simple that had been made better by an enemy's hand. I didn't want to think of them as cruel, he said. Cruelty is a human luxury. They were efficient. The night that followed stretched long enough to feel like a decision. He set the thermos within reach. He strapped on the headlamp and didn't turn it on. The pan tapped now and then like a clock for someone who had never seen a watch. He whistled a bar of an old song and the studs counting paused, then resumed in answer, off by half a beat, a learning creature coming closer to the metronome he offered. I tried speaking numbers aloud, he admitted. 1, 2, 5, 8, 13. The way a man might offer a rope to a drowning thing. It made me less afraid to hear my voice braid with the ticking. That may have been the point. When the thin filament returned, he was ready. He met it low with the knife and drove it toward the door, then poured the scalding water so the steam rose in a wall. The line vanished like thread burned out of a seam. The house settled. He sat on the floorboards with his back to the kitchen counter and watched the lantern's breathing circle for a long time without thinking a single thought he could have written down. By morning he had a plan he did not want: water, distance, a narrow place he could hold. The island. The lake wore a long skin of mist at first light, the kind that reduces the world to a few meters of admissible truth and offers concealment to both hunter and hunted with identical generosity. He slid the canoe off its rack, the old wood groaning, and carried it in a slow half-crouch to keep his silhouette low against the pale water. The paddle's blade knocked the gunwale with a hollow sound that cheered him in its plainness. I told myself the island wasn't safety, he said. Just a geometry problem I could solve. Halfway to the island the headlamp flickered even though it was off, as if some reserve charge jumped its own gap. The water tasted like pennies where spray touched his lip. The mist breathed in gentle systole and diastole. He paddled with measured strokes, not trying to be silent so much as to be consistent, counting 1,000 to 3 between each catch like a penitent at a strange rosary. The island presented a thread of sand between rocks and alder roots. He dragged the canoe above the wet line and flipped it, the hull left a clean arc in shallow water. He walked the perimeter twice, learning roots by toe and boulder by shin, pausing at a choke point where a tumble of granite made a natural throat. I stacked driftwood where I could crawl in and watch, he said. Left the lantern, the thermos there. Knife stayed with me. I kept thinking the water was a boundary they couldn't fold the same way as air. For 1 hour his belief held. The island's trees did not tick, the studs counting could not cross. His breath loosened. He chewed jerky and threw the wrapper into the canoe and then retrieved it, irritated at his own carelessness. He tapped the radio and it answered with pressure instead of news. He clicked it off and spoke aloud to measure how big his voice was in this different quiet. At 9:11 the mist thinned enough to show the shoreline and, alongside it, a ghost shoreline superimposed half a meter closer. Figures moved in the false one like fish in a double-paned aquarium. The pines' reflections drifted and then returned to the trees they represented. The water learned to be rowed. It didn't arrive as a shape, he said. It arrived as a change in weight. The beach tilted half a degree. The canoe's bow twitched like a dog's ear catching a whistle. First came a single print in wet sand, 3 crescents and an offset mark. The lake lapped it, tasting its own changed math. The filament appeared across the throat of rock where he meant to force any approach, ankle high again, shy of light, made visible by air trembling above it. He crouched and did not cut this time. He watched. The filament hummed without sound, a vibration in the soft palate rather than the ear. It crept forward, nudging small stones as a snail's antenna might test glass. I don't think it was a trap, he said. I think it was a finger. The kind a dentist uses to feel a nerve. The figure that completed the beach had scaled up between water and land, small where wavelets tested rock, taller by the driftwood. It didn't so much step as enter the spaces between stepping. Its edges were a suggestion the eye had to consent to before noticing. Close, he saw the impossibly far-set thumb mark again in the smear on wet rock. The metallic plant sap smell arrived a breath ahead of it. He angled his shoulder to the rock wall and kept the knife low, protecting tendons instead of aiming at an imagined heart. He didn't look for eyes, he looked for hinges, anywhere a plane glided over another, any articulation whose interruption might mean something. The filament licked at his boot top. He stepped into it and it recoiled as if tasting a lemon. I slashed sideways, not down. The blade bit gel that wasn't gel. Paddled with measured strokes, not trying to be silent so much as to be consistent, counting 1,000 to 3 between each catch like a penitent at a strange rosary. The island presented a thread of sand between rocks and alder roots. He dragged the canoe above the wet line and flipped it, the hull left a clean arc in shallow water. He walked the perimeter twice, learning roots by toe and boulder by shin, pausing at a choke point where a tumble of granite made a natural throat. I stacked driftwood where I could crawl in and watch, he said. Left the lantern, the thermos there. Knife stayed with me. I kept thinking the water was a boundary they couldn't fold the same way as air. For 1 hour his belief held. The island's trees did not tick, the studs counting could not cross. His breath loosened. He chewed jerky and threw the wrapper into the canoe and then retrieved it, irritated at his own carelessness. He tapped the radio and it answered with pressure instead of news. He clicked it off and spoke aloud to measure how big his voice was in this different quiet. At 9:11 the mist thinned enough to show the shoreline and, alongside it, a ghost shoreline superimposed half a meter closer. Figures moved in the false one like fish in a double-paned aquarium. The pines' reflections drifted and then returned to the trees they represented. The water learned to be rowed. It didn't arrive as a shape, he said. It arrived as a change in weight. The beach tilted half a degree. The canoe's bow twitched like a dog's ear catching a whistle. First came a single print in wet sand, 3 crescents and an offset mark. The lake lapped it, tasting its own changed math. The filament appeared across the throat of rock where he meant to force any approach, ankle-high again, shy of light, made visible by air trembling above it. He crouched and did not cut this time. He watched. The filament hummed without sound, a vibration in the soft palate rather than the ear. It crept forward, nudging small stones as a snail's antenna might test glass. "I don't think it was a trap," he said. "I think it was a finger. The kind a dentist uses to feel a nerve." The figure that completed the beach had scaled up between water and land, small where wavelets tested rock, taller by the driftwood. It didn't so much step as enter the spaces between stepping. Its edges were a suggestion the eye had to consent to before noticing. Close, he saw the impossibly far-set thumb mark again in the smear on wet rock. The metallic plant sap smell arrived a breath ahead of it. He angled his shoulder to the rock wall and kept the knife low, protecting tendons instead of aiming at an imagined heart. He didn't look for eyes, he looked for hinges, anywhere a plane glided over another, any articulation whose interruption might mean something. The filament licked at his boot top. He stepped into it and it recoiled as if tasting a lemon. I slashed sideways, not down. The blade bit gel that wasn't gel. He said. Or it was there and I had not earned the right to see it anymore. The gully held only duff and a shape where pressure had once been. He crouched and pressed his palm to earth and felt the same metallic cool stab through with plant sweetness, faint now, as if the forest had metabolized it. He waited there until stars thought about being stars and then stood because waiting can be a kind of permission. They did not appear as silhouettes against sky. They appeared as a correction to his idea of what was between 2 pines. He let his hands hang, knife sheathed along his forearm, not raised, not offered, simply present. He made himself small in posture without being prey in mind. He breathed numbers even when his mouth wanted to widen in the old mammal show of teeth. "You taught me," he said into the air as if it carried letters. "You mapped me. I learned back." His voice didn't echo. It folded into the past the way mist had folded into shoreline. The closest one flowed closer. Not even a sound of brush touched. A change in weight, a whisper in inner ear, the softening of distance by a centimeter you wouldn't notice unless you were courting or dying. At arm's reach it paused not because he could hurt it, but because a line had been drawn between 2 sets of rules and smart things hesitate at borders. He did not reach a hand. He did not offer flame. He offered a hinge. He set the knife down on granite between them and took 2 slow steps backward. It was not surrender. It was a message in a language he hoped might share meaning across kinds. I see value. I am costly. I am not for hurting. It did not pick the knife up. It adjusted the air around the knife so that the knife slid half a centimeter into a groove already cut there by 100 edge tests. The gesture was extraordinary in its gentleness. He realized then that cruelty would have been a relief, what stood before him chose precision instead. "I know what you want," he said, and his throat hurt with the effort of honesty. "You want me at the membrane. You want to fold me. To count me into your numbers. It's a good plan." The studs counting returned in the trees, not hostile, not kind, a rhythm now almost exactly his own. He found himself tapping it on his thigh and stopped and laughed, which surprised him. The figure tilted and the laugh vanished in his mouth like a moth crushed between 2 fingers. "We're not a match," he said, quieter. "Not yet. But if you follow me, I'll make you spend more than I'm worth. That's the best I can do." For a long elastic moment the world held. The ridge's wind paused. The night animals postponed their sentences. The figure coiled the space around its edges the way a flearod coils line against wind. Then it withdrew, not because he had beaten it, not because he had convinced it of anything at all, but because this encounter had reached the boundary of its usefulness. Smart predators don't waste tools. He retrieved the knife and the map he'd tucked under his belt and stood with his back toward the lake, toward the island that had taught him his price. He walked down the ridge not like a victor and not like a fugitive, but like a man who had learned that distance is sometimes a more honest weapon than heat. I left them sign, he confessed later. Semicircles on softer pine with my own blade where I passed. A language that said, I'm not moved. But I will be found again. Back at the cabin the towels still sat under doors, the pan hung from the back knob like a humble sentinel. He stepped inside and paused at the threshold, waiting for the studs counting to resume. The house answered with old wood's groans, mouse runways, the refrigerator's foolish bravery. He went to the table because he had to. There, where the map had been taken, lay the pencil again, repaired to seamlessness, set this time not as a hinge but pointing at a little cross he hadn't drawn, a tiny X at the edge of the lake where the inlet widened into reeds. I understood that too late, he said, and in the saying the story caught in his throat. It wasn't a threat. It was a breadcrumb. Or a leash. He did not go to the X that night. He barred the doors and slept in slices and dreamed not of being chased or folded but of being invited with exquisite patience into someone else's arithmetic. He woke before dawn with the taste of coins and cut grass in his mouth and knew the invitation would not expire. If you hear this later, he'd left written on the underside of the porch where rain couldn't get it, follow the semicircles in the rock. They point both ways. If the studs begin to count for you, teach your hands on purpose. Make yourself more expensive than you look. Do not mistake politeness for mercy. And when you must choose an island, choose one that shows you your own price. I am not moved, he said into the gray, and stepped out into a world that had learned him and would, with patience, try again.